Thank you very much. Good morning. The first thing to say is that the slides are in a handout in your pack. You may notice there are quite a lot of them, but don't worry, I'm not going to read them all out. And I'm very aware of the necessity of keeping to time. At the end of the presentation, I can answer a few questions. If you have anything very specific to ask as I'm going through, please do so. But if we can keep most of the questions to the end, that would be useful. Okay. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is a little bit about the UK Commission, what we do and what our view is on employer engagement in HE and what the drivers are of that and what the benefits are, both for HE institutions, for FE colleges, for employers, but then also very specifically for the students, because they're ultimately what we're focusing on when we engage with the employers. I'm going to go through a little bit of background on our research on the role of skills in economic growth, where the UK is in terms of lower level, intermediate and higher level skills, and talk about why higher level skills are so important. Then give one or two examples of successful collaborations with employers. And I haven't gone into a great amount of detail on that because obviously the people in this room will know a lot more about that in a lot more detail than I do. And I'm sure later on during the day we'll see some really interesting examples of ways in which you've worked in employers. And then finally I'll leave with some thoughts about what's going to happen in the future, particularly in a context with reducing public funding for higher education provision, pressure on employers because of the current economic climate, but an increasing demand for higher level skills for the economy. Okay. So first of all about the UK Commission. So our remit is to work with employers and encourage them to become more involved in the skills system and to invest in skills. Now the focus very much is on the skills of the workforce. That means the workforce of today, people who are currently in work, but also students as they're coming through school, college, as some will go on to university, some may go on to apprenticeships and so on. So we cover quite a wide range of areas, both vocational and academic education, and here we're going to focus on higher level skills. We've got a couple of quotes here from Vince Cable and also from Charlie Mayfield. Charlie Mayfield is the chair of our commissioners, so we have about 20 commissioners who are drawn from education, government departments, but most importantly from a large range of employers, both very small employers and larger employers in the UK. Charlie Mayfield is the chief executive of the John Lewis Partnership, and they're obviously a body that has really recognised the benefits of investing in their staff and engaging employees. And he's been a fantastic figurehead for us really in working with employers to get the message out about those benefits. Very briefly, this is the Commission's ambition. We have three main objectives to meet that ambition. So investing more in the skills of people to secure jobs and growth. So we focus on labour market intelligence, finding out what's happening in the labour market, what is the data telling us. Thinking then about how can businesses best work to invest in the skills of their workforce. Obviously, money is tight at the moment, and we want that funding that employers put in, but also that the public system puts in to have a real impact on employment and growth. This is internally for the Commission our four main objectives for the current financial year, and I think you can see from those that actually all of those linking quite clearly to increasing employer engagement with HE and working more closely with employers. So for example, we'll have more career opportunities for young people. Much of that depends on employers seeing the benefits of employing young people, training them to meet their skill needs as well, but also investing, as I mentioned earlier, in the skills of the current workforce, perhaps people who've left full-time education several decades ago, don't have very many formal skills or qualifications, and employers can really make a difference to those people by their investments. So why is investing in skills important? I mean, for everybody in this room, education and skills seem obviously to be the most important thing to invest in, but we're having some challenges in encouraging employers to see it that way as well. So I'm not sure if you can read all the writing on this slide, but the key thing is this is a comparison of the UK's economic performance with several of our OECD competitors. And that top right quadrant there is those countries with relatively high employment and high productivity. And you can see that the UK is in that quadrant. It's just just by the centre axis there. So we've got reasonably high employment, but one of the problems is that we're not aiming to be average for the OECD. The UK wants to be at the top, world-class, world-leading, and that's not something that we're really doing, as you can see by our position in that quadrant. In terms of employment, we're below a number of other European countries, below the Netherlands, below Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, and so on. And in terms of productivity, we're definitely behind that group of Nordic countries, Austria, Germany, also behind the US and France. So we have got challenges. We're doing reasonably, but not well enough to support long-term strong economic growth on a global level. Okay. And one of the problems in the UK is that improving productivity is a significant challenge. So our productivity levels are actually falling behind our major competitors. So the UK is investing in skills, in training, but other competitors are doing it more quickly and more effectively. And so we're falling further behind. So a couple of facts and figures. In 2009, about a third of the working age population was qualified to level 4 or above, and that compares to below 26% in 2002. So we are improving our skills. But as I mentioned before, other countries are doing that more quickly. And this improvement in skills is not feeding into improved productivity in the UK. One of the key issues for that is our lack of management and leadership capability, and that's something which is very clearly associated with higher level skills and training for that. One of the key issues is that managers and leaders are not using their skills effectively at work, and the people that they manage and are meant to be leading are not getting the benefits of that either. There's a lot to gain here. A 1 percentage point increase in the employment rate or productivity rate would have a very, very significant impact on GDP. So investing in skills is a way of improving the UK's economic position, helping us grow our way out of recession. And particularly investment in higher level skills is important. There's greater returns to investment for employers and for, obviously, the government in terms of increased tax revenues for that, but also for individuals there are returns to having higher skills and deploying them effectively in the workplace. I mentioned that there are challenges for skills in the UK, and you can see from this slide, the top left-hand quadrant is where we are in terms of low skills in the UK, and we are 20th compared to the 32 OECD member countries. So we're falling really far behind in addressing basic English and maths skills in the workforce. In the bottom left-hand quadrant, you can see that's intermediate skills, and we're 26th on intermediate skills, largely because a number of our fellow EU member states are particularly good at things like apprenticeships, long-term workforce development, and that's something where we've been lagging behind. And you can see that we're actually 9th for highly skilled in the OECD, and that's reasonable, but again, probably not sufficient to really compete on a global level. And very importantly, on an individual basis, for young people, we've got the 6th highest level of young people not in education, employment or training. And we know that not being in education, employment and training at a young age has very, very significant negative effects on young people. Firstly, in terms of income and income throughout their lives, but also in terms of self-esteem, mental and physical health and so on. So it's really an issue that's important to address. I'm going to move on to talk about where people with higher level skills are working at the moment, so that we can see sort of what the current picture is, and then move on to some of the challenges. So this slide, the people with higher level skills, I've used that as NQF levels 4 and 5, and they're in red on this slide, and we can see that actually a very large proportion of people with higher level skills work in professional occupations. In terms of managers and senior officials, you might expect more people to have higher level skills in those occupations, but I think that's largely a reflection of small companies with owner-managers who may not have formal qualifications in the same way. They don't necessarily need very formal qualifications, but they need, one of the things that is important is having particular skills and being able to use them, and qualifications are probably our best proxy for looking at whether people have those skills or not. But we can see that there are some areas where there are also large proportions of people with level 3 qualifications. So that's particularly in skilled trades and personal service occupations, and that's the light blue part of the bars on the chart. And those people are probably the potential entrants to HE, whether that's HE in a HEI or delivered in a FE college. So they're the pool of people that we could be focusing on as the next group of people to develop their skills and move to having level 4 skills or above. And we can see also that in terms of sectors, higher level skills are spread throughout the sectors of the economy. Yes, they're concentrated in particular sectors, public admin, education and health, for example, where there are several occupations which require licenses to practice or require a certain level of training to become professionally accredited. Also banking, finance and insurance, which may be surprising in the light of the last few years. But they're also in other sectors which we might seem more surprising. So, for example, mining, quarrying and utilities. About 42% of people in those sectors have level 4 skills and above. So I think what we can see is high level skills are concentrated in some occupations and some sectors, but actually they're found across the economy as a whole. And that's something with our work with employers is to think about not just targeting the usual suspects, so not just targeting professionals in professional services firms, but what other firms are out there that could benefit from high-level skills. And I think the lifelong learning networks and the projects that have emanated from those have done a really good job in changing the attitudes of some higher education institutions in particular, and in getting them to think more widely about what people might benefit from increased investment in skills and how high-level skills can help in jobs that perhaps were previously seen as lower-level occupations. Okay. Our most recent employment forecasts were published in January in our publication Working Futures, and what they show is that we're expecting continued growth in higher skilled occupations to 2020. So in terms of new jobs, we're expecting about 2 million new jobs by 2020 in the sort of top 3 occupational groups. But we're also expecting very, very significant requirements for replacement demand as people retire from those occupations and sectors. And the number of jobs in occupations which have typically required a degree will continue to grow, but the number of occupations which require high-level skills to be done effectively is also expected to grow. So those higher skilled occupations are going to account for 46% of total employment in the UK by 2020. And that's a very, very significant market for HEIs, FECs. It's a very significant demand for high-level skills, which at the moment is not necessarily being met in all the places where it's required. Right. There's also, we've talked about higher level skills, but I haven't really mentioned why we should invest in higher level skills, or why, if I'm an employer, I should invest in skills. What would convince me to invest in skills? We've done some work at the Commission looking at what happens in terms of firms investing in training, what's the return on that training, and this is not just higher level skills training, but training more generally. We found that training, first of all, has an impact on firm performance and productivity, but it also has a huge impact on survival rates. And these figures are very powerful when we use them with businesses. Firms that don't invest in training are on average twice as likely to fail as firms that do. This data is taken from the Workforce and Employment Relations study, and it compares the findings from the 2007 and 2001 study. The current WERS is out in the field at the moment, and the results will be back later this year. And we can see that in particular sectors, actually, firms are even more likely to fail if they don't train. So, for example, in hotels and restaurants, you're 9 times as likely to fail if you do not train your staff. So that's a really powerful message that we can send out to employers. There are direct benefits for you, not just for your staff. Training's not a cost, it's actually a benefit to your firm. The other thing really is that we've talked about skills, upskilling, providing training for your employees, but using those skills is really important as well. So we know that the supply of graduates is actually outpacing the growth of graduate level jobs, so some of those graduates are going to be underemployed. But actually what we're seeing is that there isn't much of a match between the type of skills and the areas in which graduates have skills and the type of skills that employers are looking for. So employers often tend to be looking for something very specific to them, very tailored pieces of work. They don't necessarily want their workforce to go on a full degree programme or a full H&D, H&C. They want small pieces of tailored provision. That can be very difficult to respond to, as I'm sure you all know, and employers also want this all yesterday. And for institutions which are used to having very stringent and important quality procedures, it can be very difficult to meet that demand quickly. And I know that you've done a lot of work about meeting employer demand quickly. And there's also, I suppose, an education job to be done with employers to explain why the quality of the provision is so important. So one of the other things that's important as well is not just providing new skills to employers, but also trying to make sure that they are using those existing skills effectively. And some of that comes back to the management and leadership training that we look at. We know that skills development alone doesn't increase productivity. We can see that from evidence in other countries. For example, in Germany and Austria, there's evidence that where employers try to train workers, but workers have not bought into that, or the unions have not bought into that, or works councils, there's not the same associated increase in productivity as when training is linked to a plan agreed with unions and with employer representatives. So I think often when we talk about employer engagement in higher education and higher level skills, HE institutions and FE colleges are seen as coming up with barriers to quick responsive provision, and that's certainly something that's a stereotype, and it's not something that I think is true. Generally, I think we've also got an important role to play in raising employer ambition. So we see that from the one side we talk about the benefits of investing in skills, but many employers undertrain, they don't train all their staff, and so there's a market failure there, and a lot of it I think is about information and the benefits of training. But some of it is also about employers not really being sure what they should do and how to make use of that skills. We need to have some business ambition around this, get employers to invest more. And I think that a lot of this is to do with if employers working with providers right from the beginning to develop provision that really meets their needs. And that's something that all of you in this room have been doing. I'm not going to dwell on this because I think Hefke will be covering it in more detail, but there have been, over the past decade, a large number of developments which have sought to support employer engagement in higher level skills provision, and Hefke has been responsible for providing some funding for that now. Unfortunately, as we all know, that's not going to be continuing, certainly nowhere near on the same scale as it was before. So there's a number of additional constraints on you in this room in terms of how to continue with your work, how to sustain that provision, and how to encourage employers that their investment matters as well. Obviously, the Wilson Review identified a number of ways in which university and industry can collaborate, and it focused on universities, but I think it's relevant to HE provision in FE colleges and FE provision as well in many ways. Lots of different ways of engaging with employers, and some of these I think employers don't necessarily see as employer engagement directly. I think things like sponsored studentships they probably don't directly see as that. They see as a way of potentially developing their staff, but they don't see it in quite the same formal way as they might if it was, say, a formal secondment or contract research and so on. But we know that a number of these mechanisms have been really successful in ensuring engagement from employers, and I know that later on today we're going to hear about quite a few of them in more detail. I've pulled out here from the Wilson Review some of the key recommendations which relate to the role of higher education in supporting higher level skills development. And I think what's interesting about them is they talk about links between universities and businesses, links between employers and sector skills councils as well. But number 9, which is the first bullet there, talks about both seeing foundation degrees as a qualification in their own right, but also making clear pathways available and evident to employers and to learners. I think both of those are interesting because the first comes back to the point about having small elements of highly tailored provision. So although the Wilson Review is saying a foundation degree should be a qualification in its own right, not necessarily just a stepping stone to a fuller degree, I think there's another step to take, which is saying that smaller amounts of credit can be really useful and important to specific employers and individuals. And I don't think we should dismiss provision that doesn't necessarily lead to formal qualification in full. We need to think about how, once we engage employers in one type of training, when providing some training for their employees, we might continue and develop that engagement with that employer and develop the relationships further. Okay. I've pulled out some examples of employee engagement that we're aware of at the UK Commission. A number of our commissioners are from employers, as I mentioned at the beginning, for example, BAE Systems, and they've worked to develop high-level and degree-level apprenticeships for the sector. We've also got some other examples of university technical colleges which work with employers to develop small amounts of provision, of relevant provision to that sector and to that particular geographical area. And I think they're good examples of the range of work that can be done, and I know we'll hear more about many examples that have been taking place in Sussex later. But I think the other thing to focus on is that when we think of employer engagement, sometimes we are thinking of the large employers, BAE Systems, people like Sellafield, Rolls-Royce, Jaguar. Most employers in the UK are small and medium-sized employers, and there's huge potential out there. They're also less likely to provide training to their staff and to have highly qualified staff. And so there's really a huge market there. And having local links and clear personal links with smaller employers is very important in, first of all, gaining trust and also convincing people of the benefits of higher level skills and workforce development. And that's something that you've been doing here very closely with some of the local employers. So finally, thinking about why we need to demonstrate the benefits and who we need to demonstrate them to. I think often in national level rhetoric there's a focus on demonstrating benefits to employers and then sometimes on financial return to HE institutions for engaging with employers. But actually one of the key things for me is students. What are the benefits for them? And these can be full-time students on a full-time undergraduate degree course. It can be somebody who's in their 40s, in the workforce, doing a small amount of perhaps a credit-bearing module on a course or otherwise tailored provision which will help them do their job more effectively. And I think we've got to think about, yes, for employers there's a focus on increased productivity, having work-ready graduates and so on, having relevant provision, but for students as well, there's wider benefits in terms of transferable skills, increased wages, improved career prospects. We know that the returns to level 3 and level 4 qualifications are significant. Some of that may change as the costs of provision increase and certainly as the cost of personal individual funding for HE level provision increases. But certainly there is still a benefit to holding higher level qualifications. It does vary again by sector and by occupation, and I think we need to be quite clear with students on that, what they can expect to get from their qualification as well.